Ah, this is Laborc, and it is so nice to have you here. These are the paints you need. First, we black in the darkest colors. For the suit, I chose lupercal green. Very dark and cold green, great for shadows. I'm covering all the surface of the suit with this color. Then Papa Laborc covers the cloak with barak-nar burgundy. Very dark and rich magenta, great for Mysterio's cloak. I grab the airbrush with 1 part paint, 1 part inner consistency, and my compressor is set to 4 bar. I mix barak-nar burgundy with mephiston red. I start to highlight the cape at the top with small bursts from the airbrush. Little paint, little air for drying. Then again, little paint, little air for drying. It's basically the same when you are glazing with a brush, but much faster. The airbrush I'm using has a needle size of 0.2 mm. If you don't have an airbrush, just use thin layers of paint for a similar effect, but I highly recommend getting a cheap airbrush. It will speed up the process tremendously. With the same consistency, I spray over the base with waagh flash, covering all the smoky parts of the base, and I also spray over the lower half of the cape to have a faint OSL effect from the smoke. Okay, we are done with the airbrush for a while. So guys, clean your airbrush or I will slap on your tiny hand and grab your brush. Use the same mixture we used for the airbrush. Define the highlights more with a brush using thin layers. If you use a thicker consistency, it will be harder to blend in the color, and this is a silky smooth cape, so we need silky smooth transitions and surfaces like Granny's butt cheek. Always move the paint in the same direction when applying the paint for the best results. Now with pure mephiston red, we reduce the highlight areas and make the cape more saturated. This is probably my second favorite red next to Evil Sun Scarlet. It's a little bit more on the magenta side of reds, but has a high saturation, so it can make any paint job stand out a bit, and it's a nice hue for the cape. Let's mix some Emperor's Children to our mephiston red and push the contrast on the cape. Cover around 50% of the previous layer and aim the highlights for the top folds of the cape. You see, my brush strokes won't go further where the cape folds under itself, so this way I can paint more realistic highlights. This sketching phase is very important, and your brush strokes need to follow the shape of the cape every time. Okay? Otherwise the highlights will feel a little bit off, and then I have to slap on your tiny hand. To smooth out the transitions, I'm using glazes for each previous color. I try to look for parts where the blending is a bit too rough, and I apply several layers of glaze. For the maximum highlights, I use pure Emperor's Children. Reduce these highlight areas drastically and apply the paint with thin layers. With the cape done, let's work on the suit. Now the suit is a bit tricky because it's heavily textured, and it's going to be a little bit hard to highlight the muscles under it, because these little squares are going to divert our brush strokes, unfortunately. But the good thing about heavily textured surfaces that they doesn't need much blending. Airbrush time again. Now I start to highlight the smoke with German Camo Bright Green. I mainly highlight the area in front of the character, leaving the edge of the base a little bit darker. Remember guys, small bursts and gentle trigger control. With the same color, I continue to work on the suit, trying to find the muscles under the textured surface. It's not easy, but it's a fun challenge. For the alive heroes of the game, I try to use more saturated tones and more desaturated ones for the undead heroes. So the more colorful, the more alive something looks. Not like Granny Laborc's teeth, because those things are colorful, but not in a healthy way, you know. To push the contrast more and increase the definition of the muscles, I mix some ice yellow to the German camo bright green. Try to really emphasize the ribcage, abs and thighs to make Mysterio ripped as possible. Did you guys ever wonder how come that most villains who doesn't rely on their strength are super jacked? Like you have to sign up for a gym if you're a villain or something. I think Doc Ock is the only one with a belly, but in the 90s cartoon he was juiced up as well. Since the ice yellow desaturated the suit a little bit, I used lime green to get back some of the nice vibrant green. So we used the previous layer as a value sketch. If you want to have a really saturated green, then nothing is better for the job than good old yellow. This will also create a warm feel to the highlights. I only apply this layer over the maximum highlights. Then I covered the gloves with doombull brown. For the highlights, I used ochre brown. I tried to leave the small crevices darker and only paint the patterned surface on the wrist guards. Use a thin consistency for that, but not too thin, or the paint will flow into the recesses. To avoid that, always remove the excess paint by dabbing your brush on a paper towel. Mix some ice yellow to the ochre brown to make these gold gloves shiny and apply small highlights on the shapes that face towards the sky. For the helmet, I tried to create a foggy look. First I covered the whole surface with Night Lord's blue. After that I mixed some ice yellow to the blue and sketched out some cloud-like patterns. These clouds could take any shape, and I looked online for some reference, and basically something green, purple or blue could work if you want to capture that iconic look for the character. I went with this grayish blue, but really it's up to you what color you prefer. I worked on the blends with some glazing back and forth with the two colors to have a smooth and foggy effect. Always remove the excess paint on a paper towel when you guys blending with glazes, and make sure your layer dried before you apply a new coat. Otherwise it will look corky and the surface won't be smooth no matter what you do with it. I added more ice yellow to the mix and reduced the foggy areas with some smaller cloud-like shapes. I kept blending and I sketched out the major reflections on the helmet. This is basically a glass ball, and the glass is highly reflective, so we need some shiny parts for the reflections to be believable. These highlights not going to make sense from every angle. I just make sure they make sense for the money shot of the miniature. I kept adding more and more ice yellow and pushed the contrast on the major reflections. On the cloudy parts I just add small dots around the edge of the previous layer. I didn't want to create smooth shapes. I'm really after these cloudy textures, so I'm not blending with this color, only on the reflections. Lastly, I add white to the big glint on the glass ball to make sure the focal point stays on the head. The boots felt a bit homogeneous due to the airbrushing, so I added some highlights to them with lime green. For the cape's buttons, I used the London grey and painted the edges and the eye shape of them. I highlighted it with light grey, aiming the highlights to the left side of the buttons. Lastly, I add some ice yellow to make them shiny, like Granny's eyes on a Christmas morning. The also part of the tutorial is Patreon exclusive. You can find the link to those parts in the video description. With that, Mr. Beck is done. Thanks for watching the video. If you like the content, please give it a like and leave a comment. And don't forget to download this month's free PDF guide from the video description. A huge thanks to my Patreons who support this kind of videos. With special shout out to Jonathan Rhodes, Cold Blooded Dawn, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, One Shop Joe Crafts, Glitchy McCrash, Guillaume Belanger. If you want to support the work of Papa Laborc, you can do that on Patreon. You will find some exclusive content there, PDF guides, or if you need a little bit of extra help, online coaching is also available. I hope the rest of your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.